This tutorial is for 4th grade, Module 5, Lesson 12. In this lesson, we are going to plot fractions on a number line and use those number lines to compare fractions. The first directions say plot the following points on the number lines without measuring. So we're going to use some estimation here, but we're also going to use some logical thinking when we do this. The first fraction is 1/3. So I need to divide this whole section between 0 and 1 into 3 equal pieces. So I'm going to have to do some estimating there to find my equal pieces. So I'm just going to put a couple of marks here, estimating my thirds. So I have 3 pieces, 1/3 would fall on this hash mark. So I have 1/3, the next section would be 2/3, and then the full number line would be 3/3. If I move down to my 5/6, I can see that the number line has the halfway point marked. If I'm dealing with sixths, the halfway point would be 3/6. That means I need to divide each half into 3 equal pieces, and that will give me my sixths. So again, I'm going to do a little estimating and divide each of these sections into 3 pieces. So pretty close. So there's my 6, and then 5/6 would be at this point here, because the whole would be 6/6. So 5/6 would be one less than the whole. To plot 7/12, again, I see that the halfway point has been marked, while half of 12 is 6/12. So that's the halfway point, and that means now each half needs to be divided into 6 sections in order to give us 12ths. I'm going to start by dividing the half in half, and then divide each of those into 3 sections. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Divide it in half, divide each of those into 3 sections, and there I have my 12 sections, or my 12ths. To find 7/12, it's just going to be 1/12 past the halfway point, or the 6/12. 7/12 is at this point. Now to compare my fractions, I'm going to use the greater than, less than, or equal to sign. And in the comparison, we're just showing which fraction is farthest from 0. So if I look at 7/12 and 1/2, well, here's my 7/12, and here's my 1/2 point. 7/12 is greater than 1/2 because it's farther away from 0 than the 1/2 point is. If I compare 7/12 to 5/6, I have 7/12 here again, and 5/6. 7/12 is less than 5/6 because 7/12 is closer to 0 than 5/6. The next section asks us to do the same thing. The first fraction is 11/12. Well, I've already put my hash marks in for my 12ths just like I did in the first problem, and the halfway point would be considered 6/12. Well, to find 11/12, I know that the 1/2 part would be 12/12. So 11/12 would be 1/12 before it. So here's my 11/12. To find 1/4, I'm going to divide each half into 2 pieces, and that gives me my fourths across the whole number line. And 1/4 is the first section. So here's 1/4. To find 3/8, I'm going to start by making my fourths first. So here's 4 equal pieces. Now I just need to divide each of those in half. That will give me 8 equal pieces. And 3/8 would be 3 sections past 0. Here's my 3/8 point on the number line. And the last question says select 2 fractions and use the number lines to compare them. So I'm just going to choose 2 of the fractions that we wrote. I'll choose 1/4 and 3/8. Since 1/4 is closer to 0 than 3/8, I know that 1/4 is less than 3/8. In the next section, I'm going to use the benchmark of 1/2 to compare the fractions given below. So I have a number line, and I can put 1/2 right in the middle. And we're going to use that as a benchmark to help us figure out the comparison of the fractions. So the first question asked me to compare 1/2 to 3/4. I know that if I put my fourths on the number line, 2/4 would be at the same spot as 1/2. Then 3/4 would be past the 1/2 point. That means 1/2 is less than 3/4. Moving on to question B, I'm comparing 1/2 to 7/8. Well, the halfway point, if I'm working with eighths, would be 4/8. 4/8 would be the same as 1/2. Since I have more than 4/8, I know that 7/8 is greater than 1/2. The next question has me comparing 2/3 to 2/5. Now, working with thirds is a little bit harder when we're thinking about halves, but I do know that half of 3 would be 1.5. Half of 5 would be 2.5. Since 2/3 is past the halfway mark when I'm thinking of my thirds, 2/3 would fall roughly about here on the number line, and 2/5 would fall less than half, roughly about here. I know that 2/3 is greater than 2/5. 2/3 is more than a half, 2/5 would be less than a half. Another way we can look at that is if I'm thinking in terms of my thirds compared to my fifths. 1/3 would be greater than 1/5. So 2/3 has to be greater than 2/5. If I move on to the last question, I'm comparing 9/10 to 3/5. Well, 9/10 is almost 10/10. It's just 1/10 away. 3/5 is 2/5 away. So it's 2 pieces away from making a whole, and each of those pieces are greater than 1/10. So I know that 9/10 is much closer to being one whole than 3/5. So 9/10 is greater than 3/5. Another way to look at that is the halfway point in tenths would be 5/10. 3/5 is just barely past the halfway point, where 9/10 is well past the halfway point. And that's another way we can determine that 9/10 is greater than 3/5.